Winston Churchill. 1874 to 1965. British Prime Minister standing strong and courageous to resist the Nazi forces during the gloomy period of Western civilization. At 1940 the whole Europe was under the tight control of German dictator Adolf Hitler. Only United Kingdom who stand strong and fight to prevent Adolf Hitler from succeed. British people waited to hear the church bell, the signal for the beginning of the German invasion. They urged Prime Minister Winston Churchill to refrain from war and to negotiate peace with Hitler. French leaders predict that the Nazis will collect English like a chicken. As for Churchill, he has no heart to give up the war. On the contrary, he stood up and said in Parliament with a firm face that he would continue to fight. "We will not," he shouted, "whether to raise the white flag or not. We will continue to fight until the last stage. We will fight in France on the seas and oceans, we will fight with confidence and a strong air force, no matter how much it costs, we will fight on the coast, on land. The fields, the streets, and the mountains, we will never know surrender. The survival of Western civilization is in dire straits," he said. So, if necessary, Britain will stand alone to resist the Hitler dictator, and if Britain loses, the world will fall into a new dark age. Then let us face the task and understand that if the United Kingdom and its allies are to endure for 1,000 years, the next generation will certainly say, "This is the best opportunity for British citizens." It is unbelievable that the British people have worked so hard for the nation to escape from foreign invasion. The Nazis in the end was destroyed. Winston Churchill's reputation as a stubborn and faithful man. In the face of his superior strength, his courage became the greatest example of human history. In his own life his beloved plan, repeated failures. But he continued to struggle with his political enemies and stand firm with his own beliefs until the nation put on the future on him. That is why he declared in front of the Parliament with the determination to win, "I have nothing to give but blood, hard work, tears, and blood." Churchill was born in November 1874 at the Blenheim Palace. Of course, his parents did not live in the mansion, but when they went to visit there, Churchill's time has come and he was born in a small temporary room there. Randolph Churchill, the most successful young British politician, was his father. His mother was a beautiful woman, Jenny Spencer Churchill, from New York City, and the daughter of an American financial trader who loved horse racing. The following year, Winston wrote a lot about his parents. "My mother is like a princess and a star," he said. "The moon that always gives me light. I love her very much." Winston also loves his father very much, but he rarely has a chance to talk to him. In Britain in the late 19th century, many upper-class parents lived a busy social life, such as dancing, hunting, and horse riding. Winston's nanny was Elizabeth Ann Everest. He later described her as his most trusted and close friend. When he became one of the most famous people in the world, the photo hanging on the wall of his room was that of Everest, not his mother or father. Being overweight and obese, she sincerely loves Winston. Most honestly, Winston also trusts her completely. When Winston was 7, he was sent to St. George, the most expensive scholarship school for children. Winston hated school because there he had to memorize Latin phrases and do math exercises, which was not a subject that Winston liked at all. He stubbornly refused to study. Winston were beaten as often as many corrupt students in those days. But no matter how much he was beaten, teacher could not force the child to do what he did not want to do. Fighting and be proud makes him a hero. At school, because of his stubbornness to the principal. When choosing a college, Churchill's parents did not allow him to study at Eton because Winston did not speak Latin well, so he chose Harrow School. For 5 full years. At Harrow, Churchill remained in the bottom of the class, with poor Latin and Greek. When he was perceived as ignorant of these ancient languages, he received intensive English instruction. "I have a huge advantage over a kid who is smarter than me. They all focus on learning Latin and Greek, but I learn English. I can organize English sentences very well. But as before, at Harrow School, Winston was a rebel who was never afraid to face the school administration. At one point, after being spanked without mercy, Churchill turned to the teacher who beat him and said calmly, "I will be a better person than you." With that said, he gets 2 more lashes. Unlike most kids in Harrow, Winston did not like popular sports such as cricket and football, but he excelled in swimming, horse riding, and fencing. As like he said, he soon became a champion of fencing. He also received an award from the school for his ability to recite 1,400 words in a book about major events in Roman history. After a while, his teacher began to see that when the young man wished, Churchill was interested in something, and he continued to work with the utmost care. Winston's father, Lord Randolph, also noticed his son's condition and told a friend that his son could not become a scholar but perhaps a soldier, who at that time had a career as a soldier was not very hard. Wandering around interested in his father's words and concerns, Winston agreed with his father. To attend Sandhurst Military Academy, he failed twice. In the third attempt, he was admitted to the lowest grade. In fact, his score was so low that he deserved to be a cavalryman, which at that time was reserved for the honorable and wealthy. Can only buy food to supply its horses. As before, Winston Churchill always hated the school, but now he likes the Sandhurst School because there is a direct implementation of the rules of defense against enemies, such as learning to destroy bridges and cut off roads. Winston later wrote that Sandhurst was a new beginning of his life. There he graduated with honors, finishing 8th in a class of 150 students. Possibly, however, after graduating, Winston fell into 2 tragedies. His beloved father and dearest wet nurse have passed away. By enlisting in the 4th Hussars Cavalry, Churchill found his life as a soldier in the absence of war filled with gloom. In 1895, under the tutelage of his mother, he was appointed a military observer in Cuba, where rebels were fighting for freedom from Spanish rule. A London newspaper bought his article about the dispute there. He later rejoined the cavalry, and was sent to India. He traveled 3,000 kilometers to the border in northwestern India, where Malakand's army was suppressing an uprising against British rule in India. He fought in the war, killing at least 1 rebel warrior, and was praised by an officer. From his experience in India, he wrote a book with the title Is the Story of the Malakand Field Force. He later traveled to Egypt, where General Herbert Kitchener led his forces up the Nile to avenge the Davis tribes that had defeated the British and killed General Gordon. On the day of his arrival in Sudan, he rode into the ranks of the 2,000-strong line in the largest and most recent cavalry attack in British history. 20 British spearmen were killed in the attack, but the Davis fled. During the River War, Churchill was critical of General Kitchener, who ordered the removal of the body of the leader of the Davis, removed from the grave and cutting the body into pieces. After campaigning on the Nile, Churchill traveled to India to join his comrades in arms in the cavalry, then at the age of 24 decided to pursue a career as a politician, he returning to Britain to run for Parliament. A desperate young candidate who graduated from Harrow School, Winston actually has a long way to go in politics. In his first campaign for the House of Parliament, Churchill failed. However, he was later paid by a London newspaper to work as a correspondent for the war in South Africa. There, British troops fought hard against Dutch settlers in what historically referred to as the Boer War. Arrested by the Dutch, Churchill looked even more impatient. He escaped from prison in search of freedom as a poster offered his return, whether dead or alive was found. The story revolves around the adventures of Churchill that he returned to England as a national hero. As he ran for Parliament again, he lost the election. The first few years in the Nichols Parliament were full of controversy. As a member of the Conservative Party, he was deeply saddened by the plight of the British people and wanted the government to play a more active role in helping the people. As a result, he was severely questioned and later criticized by Conservative leaders. He later won one of the seats in the Liberal Party. There has been remarkable progress in his politics. He became Under-Secretary of State for Colonial Territory, an advisor to the king, and chairman of the Trade Committee, and in 1910 served as Minister of the Interior, who has the right to occupy a large number of national obligations. When Churchill realized that poverty was his enemy, he called for an increase in taxes on high-income earners and a tax on the sale of land. He supports state-owned property such as roads, railways, canals and all monopoly property. He says the elderly, the sick, and the children are receiving special care and supplies from the state. But he thinks the minimum wage and maximum working hours should be taken. At times, even his colleagues in the Liberal Party wondered if Churchill wanted to be outspoken and neglected his policies. They did not fully trust his imagination. Throughout his busy life, Churchill was still able to find time to get married and start a family. His fiancée is a beautiful girl, Clementine, but Churchill calls her Clammy. When they married in September 1908, she was 23 years old and Churchill was 33 years old. Some who know the child Churchill, who has been stubborn since childhood, predict life of his marriage will not last long. But more than 50 years later, Clementine was still standing next to Winston when he waved to the people of London on his 90th birthday. One duplicate once wrote that I was married and lived happily ever after. Constantly fond of military strategy and foreign affairs, Churchill found himself deeply entrenched in all of this since July 1911, when a German warship, the Panther, bravely sailed to the port of Agadir, North African coast. By doing so, King Kaiser of Germany declared to the world that he was competing for British supremacy at sea. King Kaiser William also warned France, a British ally, that if necessary, Germany would strike to stop French expansion into new territories in Africa. Churchill was aware of the threat of another powerful German new enemy under Kaiser. Shortly afterwards, Churchill was convinced that one day war would break out between Britain and Germany, so Britain had to be well prepared. With the appointment of a Navy chief, he spent a lot of time at sea. In 1913 he persuaded Congress to provide money to install 15 guns on the warship, and change the ship from coal to oil tanker. This change gave the British ships an advantage over the Germans in both speed and force. When World War I broke out in August 1914, Churchill was not surprised. The British Navy, equipped with modern equipment and advanced readiness, believed it could defend the North Sea against German aggression. As one general said, because of Winston, the Navy is already prepared. At the even of the war almost brought the end of Churchill's political career. The most serious failure was his leadership in the Gallipoli campaign. He proposed sending British troops across the Strait of Daniel Sea and later capturing the Turkish capital, Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. Weapons and ammunition could later be shipped to Russia, while Russian wheat could also be exported. As a result, Turkey, an ally of Germany, was easily ousted, but unfortunately the First British Army refused to provide troops to Churchill, arguing that the bloody battle in France was more important than Churchill's plan. After its first naval victory, the government decided to send troops to Churchill, but it was too late. The arrival of Turkish aid troops and the British commander's foolish decision made the situation worse. After weeks of bitter attacks, France and Britain withdrew, with about 55,000 of their troops killed. Dangerous failed attack in the Gulf of Daniel falls on Churchill. The opposition groups put a blame on him. Churchill eventually resigned from the cabinet. He returned to the front line for a while, serving as a combatant in France. Later, he was appointed Director of Food and Ammunition, and it was there that he began to master the use of air force in the tensions between the warring powers. His main idea was the equipment he had created and admired throughout his life is the tank. The British used tanks a little too fast and too few to complete the victory. However, it remained one of the reasons for the Allies' victory over Germany and the signing of the First World War I treaty. Although Churchill has made a real contribution to the war, public memory of the Gallipoli campaign has remained in their minds for a long time. Prime Minister Lloyd George appointed him as War and Air Force Affairs. He also served as Secretary of the Colony, acting as a mediator between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. In 3 election campaigns to return to parliament. He still fails every time. At the same time, with the success of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in Russia, began to believe that the British Labour Party was a source of threat. A real threat to Britain, possibly even bringing socialism or communism into Britain. Therefore, a little later he joined Conservative Party. In 1924 he was appointed Financial Minister, the second most influential post in the United Kingdom. For Churchill, it was a hobby because he did not like statistics and economics. He is often seen tired of discussing financial matters. In this new position, he took advantage of many issues and developed a smarter strategy. In 1929, the Conservatives lost the election. By no longer being an official in the cabinet, he spent more time with his family. He spent every weekend at the mansion, the countryside of Chatwell, where he spent the money to sell his work to buy it. It's his favorite place there, he enjoys, especially in running around with the kids or spending time painting. In early 1932, Churchill warned of dangers that allowed Germany to rearm. He predicted that the war-torn Nazi ideology would one day shake the world. Although Hitler continued to build a strong army and a good air force, British MPs just laughed for his warnings. Also, threats from Hitler and dictators of Italy Benito Mussolini seems far less important when ethnic Britain is unemployed due to the country's economic crisis. People line up to distribute bread. Winston stood alone in calling for countermeasures as Hitler gradually expanded his forces. In 1936, Nazi leaders recaptured the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of WINSTON, which ended World War I. 2 years later, Nazi troops invaded Austria and declared the country part of German territory. In 1938, at the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to give Germany control of Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia, although Churchill directly warned that Hitler would not be satisfied with the small plot of land. 6 months later, Churchill's predictions at the Munich Conference came to fruition. The Nazi army continued to occupy the Rhine. The Nazi army continued to occupy the remainder of Czechoslovakia. Long night too. Finally, on September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the border into Poland. Britain responds by declaring war, and World War II begins. 2 days later, Churchill was appointed to the position. The place he held during World War I was the Navy commander. Celebration erupted among the British sailors and sailors when it was heard that Churchill had returned to his old position. But the military defeat was still rampant, and the British people were skeptical that a peace agreement could be reached with the Hitler and that the fighting would end. Finally, on May 10, 1940, King George VI summoned Churchill to meet him. He was chosen by all parties to be appointed Prime Minister. Keep in mind that it is the most important opportunity in his life to accept this top position. The Nazi squadron struck Britain day and night. Germany initially bombed military targets, but later hoped to demoralize civilians. Nazi planes launch attacks on London 24 hours a day. When bombs fell from the sky, the whole city melted to the ground, burning wildly and sometimes out of control. Millions of Londoners were killed. The siren warns of an all-night airstrike every night as civilians gather in underground shelters. For Churchill, it was his first test. He believes that for the United Kingdom and the British people, it is a very important time for them. With strong body and biting cigars stuck in his teeth, he was found everywhere, such as in military bases, factories, mountains, the streets of London and in Parliament. With the tiger's jaw pointing forward, he raised his finger in a V-shaped victory sign, a symbol of British non-surrender to the Nazis. Every day when British's Spitfire and Hurricane chased down enemy bombers' airplane, failure of Germans in space, increasingly British planes strike. Fierce attack on Nazi invaders gathered at Channel Harbor and caused severe damage. In the first few days of the attack, more than a quarter of the pilots in the British Air Force lost their lives. Troops still not training hard, replaced a comrade who lost his life in reluctant to give up despite exhaustion and bloodshed. However, British troops continued to fight. Finally, Hitler issued an order to stop its invasive operations. It's called Operation Sea Lion. Only a handful of brave British airmen changed the course of the war. The tide of war flames began to rise gradually. Following the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Port Harbor, the United States plunged directly into the war in collaboration with Britain. Churchill, who never forgot that he was of American descent at the time, was overjoyed. Later, when Hitler should attack the Soviet Union, Churchill invites the communist country to join anti-Nazi alliance. In November 1942, British troops achieved a major victory in the Egyptian city of El Alamein, advancing on the Swedish Canal, which was still British at the time. As the fighting continued, Churchill worked harder to build an alliance during the war, an alliance between Britain, Russia, and the United States. He repeatedly traveled to Washington and Moscow. He has convened major meetings of Allied leaders in the Canadian, Moroccan, Quebec, Iran, Yalta, Ukraine and Germany right-wing areas. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the coast. France in the largest land and water attack in history. When British tanks crossed the river into German territory, sent themselves behind the line, insisting that his troops continue to advance. After April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler, who Churchill called the villain, committed suicide. A few days later, the remaining German forces surrendered unconditionally. On the way to the English vocabulary in front of the bustling MPs, Churchill shouted, "Britain is moving forward. Long live the cause of freedom. Let the God save the King." August 1945, the Japanese Empire surrenders, and World War II ends. Immediately after the German surrender, the Conservatives lost the election. Despite being 71 years old, the Churchill D. Churchill decided not to retire, instead spending the rest of his life writing historical stories and warning of new dangers posed by the ambitious and armed Soviet Union. Modern. In 1951, just before his 77th birthday, Churchill became Prime Minister again. As he neared the age of 80, some of his co-workers noticed that Churchill had changed. He walks more curved, sometimes feeling hungry or deaf and feeling daydreaming. But when asked by a journalist if he was afraid of going to death, he replied that I was ready to meet God, whether or not my God was ready to meet me. However, he finally realized that the time had come for him to step down. In 1955, he returned to his rural home in Chatwell. There he lived a quiet life, spending his last days painting, writing and playing with his grandchildren. For his honorable, there is a note. Honorary Doctor from University's Literature Nobel Prize winner and Citizenship America under. Approved by all U.S. Congress. In addition, he received a commission from Queen Elizabeth as he is called Sir Winston. On his 80th birthday, I was honored by the House of Commons, with all the members of the House standing silently as English anthems and hymns rang out for him. Winston Churchill died on January 24, 1965. His coffin was laid to rest in the House of Ministers, later at St. Paul's Church, with the British flag on it. He was finally placed next to his parents' grave in a small pavilion at St. Martin's Church. History will remember him as a leader who brought pride to Britain in the dark ages of the 1940s. It is he who raised his hand to Hitler and led the Allies to a successful Second World War. For a weak democracy, including the United States, Churchill has become a symbol of unwavering toughness. He is a confident leader who has liberated the freedom that his villain has trampled on. In this sense, he is also likely to be on the list of people who defend the cause of democracy. The power of Churchill's words and his courageous leadership moved the British people to stand shoulder to shoulder with the storm of dictatorship, and through these merits he will be remembered forever by all Western civilization countries.